Okay, so this is just basic terminology for parts of the drum set and some basic playing techniques. So, of course, we have the drums. We have the kick drum, snare drum, which you can have snares on or snares off. We have our toms. We can have one or two rack toms, and then the floor tom, right, which very often has adjustable legs like this. But it can also be attached via an arm bracket to a cymbal stand or something else. Then we have the cymbals, right? And typically you're going to have the ride cymbal, the crash cymbal. Right, in this case we have two, one on the right and left side of the drum set, and the hi-hat. Hi-hat's the only instrument on the drum set that you can play with more than two limbs, right? So you can use right hand, left foot. Now let's talk about some more specific techniques and parts of these instruments that you get different sounds from. So first off, we'll go back to the snare drum. You can just do a single tap, right? This is just a basic striking. Sometimes it's called a piston stroke, right? Other times it's called tapping the drum, other times called a strike or a hit. And then you can do what are referred to as rolls, and there's different types of rolls. There are what we call single stroke rolls. This is where you're rapidly alternating right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, or left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. And so you can play open, which means there's more space or more openings between the notes, or closed, where there's less space in between the notes of the single stroke roll. Right? So the key here is to think about open essentially as being slower rhythm and closed being a faster rhythm. Right? So that's open and closed single stroke rolls. You can also do double stroke rolls where we do two sounds or two taps for one movement. That's a diddle. And it actually sounds like diddle, right? So we're going to say that. And then we have what's called a long roll, open roll, or double stroke roll, which is based on combinations of diddles alternating between hands. So right, right, left, left, right, right, left, left. This would be open. Or closed. Right? Compare that to the single stroke roll. Very similar. The goal is to sustain sound, but there's a little bit of a different sound between single stroke and double stroke. And then a third type of roll, which is most often used on snare drum, though you could use it anywhere on the kit you want, is what's called a concert or a buzz roll, also sometimes called a closed roll. A closed roll, and this is where you do a buzz in each hand. This is where you do multiple bounces of the stick. By the way, this is also why it's called multiple bounce roll. So, and the goal is just to let the stick bounce as much as possible before lifting. You want to try and make sure that the sound stays level and doesn't diminish so much that you get this where the sound dies away. So you don't want to do, right? You want to make sure you're lifting before it completely dies away. Right, same thing in the other hand. Right, same movement as a double stroke. We'll talk about that later, but for right now, think about just doing very open where you can hear the individual buzzes or multiple bounces. So open would be, if I close it up, it would sound like this. So we have three different types of rolls which you can use on any of these drums, though. Snare drum, we typically use that third the most. So single stroke, double stroke, and buzz. You can hear each one is sustaining the sound, but there's a different amount of separation. And typically when we're playing the tom-toms, it's not that you can't do a buzz roll, but typically we do double strokes or single strokes, right? So, or, and because the tension is different on each drum, you'll notice that I don't have to work as hard on the doubles. I have to use a little of a different technique to articulate on those lower drums. Good. So going back to the snare drum, we can also think about using the rim and the drum head in different combinations for different sounds. A rim click is this, right? Rim click is where you're not just getting the sound of the rim, which is a very cool sound in itself, but trying to get the combination of part of the drumstick on the drum head resonating while you're doing this. Notice when I lift up my fingers, it's a more resonant rim click, but when I take my 3 back fingers and do that, it closes it up. A common technique to think about is think about cupping your hand almost like that, and that way you get this really warm, rounded sound versus more of a muted sound. You can also do what's called a stick shot, where you take one stick to press against the drum head, use the other one to hit it. And then of course you can do what's called a rim shot, where you're basically hitting both the rim on the edge here and the drum itself. You can get just the rim versus the full rim shot. Right, they each have their own technique. Finally, you can do what's called, typically we have a piston stroke, which is like a piston immediately moving up and down, right? So as soon as it moves down, it comes back to its starting height, just like a piston. But you can also do what's called a dampened or dead stroke, like that. Very different. There's a resonance to that. This dampens it. Finally, for all these drums, we have the edge of the drum, which is the most resonant part. Sustains the longest. And then what's referred to as the node, which is the very center of the drum. This is the least resonant point. And as you move towards the edge, it changes the timbre a little bit, but also increases the resonance, and it can move towards me or away from me. So node, least resonant. This is true for all of them. Moon gel helps, but like this one that has less moon gel, you can hear a little more resonance there. Okay, going to the kick drum very quickly. Some commonly used terms. We have beater into the head, which is again like that dampened stroke I just showed you, and then where we let the beater bounce off the head, more of a resonating stroke. And depending on the sound you want, it really makes a difference. This one, I've crammed a couple of pillows into it because I want more of a dampened, less resonant sound, right? So it doesn't matter really if I do a dead stroke or rebounding, they're gonna sound the same, or at least very close. But especially on drums where you're letting the head naturally vibrate and you don't have something like blankets or a pillow or something dampening, you can really get a completely different sound by playing with that into the head versus beater off the head sound. Then we can also play on the rims of all these drums. Even on the shell of the bass drum. Speaking of shell, if we come around this way, go and get a side view of the floor tom, in a lot of Afro-Cuban styles, there's something called cascara, which is the shell of the drum, where you can literally play the stick on the shell or side using just the tip of the stick or the shaft of the stick. You get a thinner sound with the tip, thicker sound with the shaft. Right, so a lot of times we do that on the shell of the floor tom, right? Good, coming back up to the aerial view of the kit here, we have the cymbals now to talk about. I'm gonna start with the ride cymbal over here. There's so many places you can hit on a cymbal to get different sounds. But in reality, most of our general playing is gonna focus on 3 distinct areas or 3 distinct regions of the cymbal. First off is the very edge. Similar to the drum head, this has the most resonance, right? This is the most sustaining sound. And then we have the opposite of that, which is the bell, which is sort of like the node of the cymbal. And depending on the size of the cymbal's bell and how high it goes and a variety of other spatial factors, you can get different sounds. Also notice when I play with the tip of the stick on the bell, I get one type of sound versus if I play with the shaft, right? Versus if I play directly in the center of the bell versus closer to the edge of the bell. And where we hit with the stick, if I play with the shaft of the stick through the cymbal, even on something like a ride cymbal that's on the drier side, I can still get a really big crash. So you can get a lot of different sounds out of a cymbal, and this is also true for the crash. We should talk about this for a second too, primarily with cymbals on drum set, but you can also do this on drums, not just the cymbals, which is dampening. Sometimes called a cymbal choke, and you can do a partial choke like that, where you're just taking one of your fingers or 2 of your fingers and kind of pushing it down like that, or take your hand and grab it while you're keeping some element of a fulcrum here. I like to do it this way. There's no right or wrong, but usually I take the back 3 fingers and the thumb and do that, because there's situations where you don't have time to choke with the other hand. You may have to choke with the same hand, right? You can do the same thing on the drums, right? In terms of, it's referred to as muffling. Timpanists will often do this. So I might do that to get a quicker articulation, something that's less sustained, right? And you can also do combinations of dead strokes or dampened strokes and regular strokes. Right, so especially like when I've been in a recording studio recording drums, if there's like a really short cutoff and I have time to do it, I might do that versus letting it ring out. This brings us to the hi-hat, where I think out of all the instruments on the drum set, this is probably the most versatile, again, because we can use our foot and our hands. But similar to what we saw with the open and dampened tones, you can also get what's called a closed hi-hat sound. This is where both of the cymbals, the top and bottom on the hi-hat, close, and there's no separation or no lifting. It's almost like a dead stroke on a drum. The very short, distinctive sound versus an open hi-hat, which would sound like this. Sometimes it's referred to as a splash. So open or splash and closed. And of course you can do this in all kinds of combinations. So, you know, if I want to go ahead and do completely open with the foot, we get a splash. If I want to do completely closed, sounds like that. But I can also use smaller gradations, and you can barely see it, but I have the cymbals just barely apart. I'm getting kind of a combination of that closed chick-chick sound and the splashier sound. When you incorporate the sticks, you can really add a lot when you play with different parts of the stick on different parts of the cymbal, just like the ride and crashes. You have a bell, center area, edge, and depending if I'm using the shaft or the tip, I get a different sound. But with the hi-hat, I can also play with how much distance is between the bottom cymbal and the top cymbal. A lot of beginning players, when they think open hi-hat, they think they need to open the hi-hat all the way. By the way, this part of the hi-hat, we should talk about this. This is the rod, which goes all the way down to the bottom of the hi-hat, where the foot is controlling the up and down movement. And this is referred to as the clutch, which I'll break down in just a second by removing the top cymbal. But while we got both cymbals on, we got our top cymbal, bottom cymbal. I like to keep the distance between them pretty great. Maybe not a tremendous amount, maybe not like that much, right? You want to make sure that as you push it down, you can hit. But I try to really maximize it, because the idea is I want to get the widest dynamic range possible. Dynamics referring to volume. If the cymbals are really close together, even if I'm really slamming my foot down hard, it's not moving as far, so I'm just not going to get as much volume. So I like to keep my hi-hats pretty high. And I recommend actually, you know, if you're really having trouble with that, lowering it, but eventually get to where you have that wide dynamic range. I'm going to go ahead and start with completely closed to completely open and all the gradations in between. I'm adding extra pressure with my foot to get the chickiest, brightest, shortest sound possible. Releasing the pressure on my foot. Now notice the cymbals are still in contact, but just by releasing a little bit of pressure from my foot, it's already got a little bit more of an open sound. I'm going to keep raising that top cymbal gradually. One last thing as we're talking about this, and this can really impact how you use the hi-hat, is making sure, and this is one of those common things, with this clutch we have metal part, piece of felt, felt, metal part. You don't want metal against metal like this bottom washer right up against the cymbal, or vice versa, so the felt helps. There's even more sophisticated setups than this, but this is the most basic. Making sure that both parts are tight against the threading here, meaning that if you have anything loose against the threading, you might have the bottom part of this start to wiggle loose, and then all of a sudden you're playing and your hi-hat just drops and you have no more control. So that's a very quick overview of a lot of different terms and concepts for different parts of the drum set. Explore these different sounds.